I'm going to show you how to go from a boring filing cabinet like this to a fun filing cabinet like this using only one power tool. You're going to take your blank canvas and lay it down on its side and measure all the sides because we're going to be adding just a little bit of trim. Once you've purchased your thin trim, you're going to measure it to size and cut it with the miter saw. The miter saw is the only power tool we're going to use throughout this entire process, which is good because I love my miter saw. Cuts like butter. Next, we're going to paint the trim with the bare marquee line. We're only using our paint for the trim, and we only need this little tiny jar for it. Whenever you have a screw cap like that, make sure you wipe down the sides or you'll never get it open again. Whenever you're painting trim, you want to start with very little paint on your roller. This will help you to avoid any kind of drips. You're going to do a second coat anyway, so really don't put on a ton of paint onto that roller. Resist the urge. You can see here that I'm starting by painting the sides, then I'm going to paint the flat surface of the board. You don't need to paint the underside because we're going to be gluing that onto the filing cabinet. I'm going to skip showing you that I did a second coat, but make sure you do a second coat. I'm going to be using paint sticks for this project because they're super cheap, and I learned that you need about 6 of these bundles to get down the middle of the filing cabinet in your pattern. Then I'm measuring them here because I'm going to be cutting them off where the little dip in the sticks are. And here again is the miter saw. Yay! I'm taping the sticks and then marking them. I'm making them all the same consistent length. That will really help with the project. And then I'm using the tape to still cut it. That keeps things from kind of flying everywhere because the miter saw is much more powerful than this thin little wood. I'll be using more than the 6 bundles, but I won't have to cut the rest down to length, and you'll see why later. Now I'm going to attach the trim. The Gorilla Glue that I'm using wants everything to be wet. It adheres better that way, so you see me wiping it down with a wet wipe before I glue it on. Once I glue it on, I am using painter's tape to hold it in place while it dries. What makes this project so easy is that we're not going to be using any nails. You're only using Gorilla Glue throughout the whole project. Here I am now measuring to the center, and I'm going to mark a center line all the way down the rest of the filing cabinet. This is going to be the center line that I'm going to be using for my herringbone pattern. Let's speed this up just a little bit, shall we? Next, you want to put some painter's tape on the end of one of the sticks. Because we are not painting them, you do not want to mark directly on them. Here I am measuring the middle of the end of the stick and then that same distance on the side, and I'm drawing a diagonal line to where those 2 points will meet. This is the line that you're going to use to line up your herringbone pattern. You also want to make sure that you're using a 45-degree angle here consistently while you're using your pattern. I think a lot of people think that it's going to be the point of the stick that's going to be the middle of your design, but that is not true. You're going to use the line that we drew to keep it centered. And you can see that I have staggered a couple boards with that line on the tape. This will help me make sure that I'm staying consistent and I'm always keeping centered to my design. I'm going to glue down my first 2 pieces as sort of an anchoring point. I'm wetting them down and gluing them, and I'm going to let them dry. They'll be really stable and they'll help me keep my pattern consistent when it's ready to set all the rest of the pieces. My anchoring pieces were dry, and so now I'm going to wet down the other pieces and glue them on so that they can all begin to set up my design. You'll notice I'm using a wet sock to wet down all the pieces. Using wet wipes over and over again was just not going to be friendly to this project. You'll notice throughout this project that I only do a couple boards at a time. Because we are using paint sticks and they are thinner, they're not always perfectly straight. So once I get these set, you're gonna see that I do have to put things down on top of them to hold them in place and keep them from peeling up. So it's just easier for me to only do a couple boards at a time. I realized that I don't want the blue tape to get stuck around the boards because once it's glued, it's not going anywhere. So I was making sure I was peeling up the blue tape so that it didn't get into the edges when I'm gluing everything down. Right about here is where I realized that the pieces can get warped and I was gonna have to start putting things down, and I used a bunch of paint cans to accomplish this. It's now the next day and I'm gonna continue my pattern. Again, I'm just going to do a couple boards at a time, and I'm staggering out the boards that have the blue tape on them to make sure I'm staying consistent in my pattern and I'm keeping it perfectly centered. It's pretty easy to get off track, and you'll see in a little bit that I do at one point and then I have to make some modifications. So I highly recommend using the sticks with the blue tape to make sure you're always on that line. I actually really love the paint sticks. I'm glad that they're pretty cheap because they create such an interesting pattern. No two sticks are alike, and I love that. So I'm gonna put down a stick now with blue tape, and I'm gonna realize that's not quite right on the line. So you're gonna see me still moving around some of the boards. Thankfully they are still wet, and so I was able to move them and space them. And I generally always stop with the board that has the blue paint on it and then hold everything down. Okay, I'm slowly working my way down to the end of my filing cabinet. It's starting to look pretty exciting and really good. As you continue with the project, you're going to notice that some of the boards might have some spacing between them to keep consistent with the pattern, especially because these are paint sticks and they're not perfect edges. That is okay. Trust the process. We're going to be using wood filler later, and I swear you're not going to see any of these spaces once we're done. As I got to the bottom, now I'm going to have to start cutting some pieces at the ends to continue the pattern, and for this I'm going to be using miter shears. I just used a ruler against the trim and then marked the line that I'm going to be cutting. Not measuring anything, so it made it pretty easy. You guys, I want to be perfectly honest with you. The miter shears are not easy to use. They really hurt my hand. I don't have a super strong grip, so I don't super love them, but I didn't want to go out and use the miter saw again because I'd have to be going out there constantly to cut piece by piece, and that wasn't going to be an efficient way to complete this project. So I did use the miter shears, but at some point I'm going to ask my husband to help me because he has a stronger grip, and he's going to use the miter shears for me. You gotta love husbands. See, watch as I struggle to get this piece cut. I do hate measuring though, so I'm pretty happy that all I have to do is line up the pieces and draw a line to cut them. The very bottom, it's just constantly cutting the pieces down to size and gluing them once I'm sure they're the right size and it's keeping in the shape of the pattern. And this is what it's going to look like. It actually is really great, and now it's time to start with the sides. For the sides, you're going to have to cut each and every piece, which is why I got the miter shears. You can see my husband's legs there in the background because I'm handing the pieces to him and he's cutting them down for me. I'm dry fitting the pieces to make sure they're the right length, and then I'm gluing them down. You can see I'm using that glue can to hold down the ends to keep the boards perfectly flat. It is a struggle throughout this project, and you really can't use clamps. Our construction foreman wanted to watch the progress and make sure we were doing everything correctly. It's somewhat tedious, and she did eventually get bored with us. Had to watch that tail, make sure she wasn't getting it into the glue though. That was fun. Here's a good angle so you can see that I'm using the ruler, I'm holding it against the trim, I'm drawing the line. I'm really just looking down on it to make sure the ruler is right at the edge of where the trim is. Sometimes we did cut the trim a little bit too short, but that's okay because we're going to use caulk at the end. Once you get down to the ends, you do have to continue the herringbone pattern again, so it does make for multiple cuts yet again, and the pieces get smaller and smaller. And smaller. I didn't film doing the other side, but once it was all complete, this is what it looked like. Pretty nice, huh? Now I'm going to start filling in all the little lines that you can see. I don't want to make them disappear because I do actually really love the design of the herringbone, but I do want to make them less noticeable. So I'm just using the little plastic wood and using my finger to go along all the little seams. I am really rubbing that wood filler in with my finger and pushing it down into those cracks. You can certainly use gloves while you're doing this. I didn't get any splinters though. I just want to make that clear. No splinters happened here. I did get a blister though. Now I'm going to use wet wipes before it's completely dried because I don't want the wood filler on the flat surfaces of the boards. I really just wanted it inside of the creases, so I'm wiping it off before it has a chance to dry. That way I don't have to sand it later with a sanding block. It gets it all off for me if you're washing it while it's still wet. This also was a really tedious process because you can see I didn't just do the ends where all the boards meet. I did go in between each and every board. So you do a couple, and then because you don't want the wood filler to completely dry, then you use a wet wipe to wipe off the surfaces. At the top is without wood filler, and then we're panning down to where I did use wood filler. It's quite a difference. Now I am going to caulk along the edges, and so my trick for getting perfectly straight caulk lines is I'm going to use painter's tape. I'm using some against the trim so that the caulk really doesn't get on the trim, and then I'm doing a very small space on the wood itself so that the caulk can go in between them. It was really hard to make a perfect caulk line because the wood is not completely flat because it's different pieces of wood. That is okay because as you can see here, I'm using a wet wipe around my finger to make the caulk perfectly flat. Tape and a wet wipe are my favorite way to ensure that I have perfect caulk lines. I did have a little imperfection here, so I just filled it again with a little bit of caulk while everything was still wet and smoothed it out. Perfect. While the caulk is still wet, I am pulling up the tape that's on the trim because I'm going to do a really quick paint job on the trim just to make sure it's perfect. I'm rushing because I do want to pull up the tape before the caulk can dry so that the caulk won't pull up with the tape. Pulling the tape is actually where I always get my messiest. And this is the finished product, you guys. I did both sides. Obviously, didn't want to walk you through doing the second side. But what do you think? Please tell me what you think of this project. And please, if you do try it yourself, let me know and add a comment with your photos. I really love this project. I hope you do too. You can find me on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.